and welcome back, or just welcome if you're new here. I'm Common Free. I'm an employment relations practitioner, and I'm also the owner and director of Free Employment Relations. I've included a list of my credentials in the description box below to give you some peace of mind around the content that I share. My disclaimer for today's video is my usual disclaimer. I share a lot of information in these videos, but I'm not able to cover every exception to the rule or every nuance. Therefore, these videos are for educational purposes only. Please contact a professional if you need further assistance. Today's video is about the wording on disciplinary warnings, how to write the offense on warnings, some tips, and some things that are commonly done that I would advise people not to do. Who is this video for? This video is predominantly for employers, managers, leaders, HR practitioners, or anybody who is issuing disciplinary warnings. It can also be useful to other employment relations practitioners, and I think that employees could also gain some value from today's video just in terms of understanding why warnings or offenses on warnings are phrased in a particular way. Just something to keep in mind when you watch this video. A lot of what I'm going to discuss in today's video is recommendations around best practices when it comes to wording on warning. That doesn't mean that should a warning or the offense on a warning not be done in the way that I'm describing in this video, that it is unfair in terms of the legislation. Some of what I'm recommending is for reasons related to improving the employment relationship. But when I say something is fair or unfair, there I'm referring to what the legislation expects. Complying with the legislation is a minimum that is required of employers. And while I do cover compliance with the legislation in this video, a lot of my recommendations are around improving the effectiveness of the employment relations. In today's video, I'm not going to be discussing all of the information that goes on a warning. In the description box below, there's a link to my website. For a small fee, you can purchase my warning templates. Today's video is specifically around the wording of the offenses on warnings. I also have other videos dedicated to tips around issuing warnings, so you can check out my channel for that. So first up, please stop putting gross misconduct on warnings. Warnings are used for disciplinary matters. They should not be used for other things. For example, it is not appropriate to use a warning for incapacity matters, be it incapacity due to poor work performance or other types of incapacity like medical incapacity. If you are having difficulties related to incapacity, again, check out my website, check out my channel. There are resources on there dedicated to how to deal with poor work performance appropriately. Warnings, however, should be reserved for disciplinary matters. So that is to say, it should be reserved for when a rule is broken. That rule does not need to be written down. It can be a verbal rule or a commonly understood rule, or it's for when a particular standard is broken. Incapacity is where the performance standard is not met. In another video, I'll go into more detail on how to differentiate between poor work performance or disciplinary matters. But the main thing to bear in mind is that disciplinary matters relate to a rule or a standard that has been broken. Now, if you are issuing a warning, which should be reserved for disciplinary matters, it is by definition for misconduct. It shouldn't be used otherwise, and therefore writing misconduct on a warning is redundant. So my recommendation for what to do instead of saying misconduct in that you did X, Y, and Z, I would recommend that you use the appropriate categorization for the offense. So for example, you start by saying negligence or insubordination or dishonest conduct. These are not technically categorizations. I refer to them as such. They're technically a descriptive term or a general term that gives us a quick insight into the type of offense that was committed. But if you don't know what a general word would be that would cover that particular offense, my recommendation, instead of writing misconduct, is simply to leave it off and move straight into detailing the offense. I'm going to be sharing a lot of tips in this video on how to detail the offense. So at the beginning of this tip, I said, please don't put gross misconduct on a warning. Now I've explained why not misconduct. Now I'm going to explain why I recommend leaving off the word gross. So I wouldn't always recommend not using the word gross. There are times that I would recommend it and where I do think it is appropriate to use. But more often than not, what I see happen is that it's simply put in front of other words like gross misconduct, gross negligence, gross insubordination to make it seem like the offense that was committed is more serious than it was. The word gross, it implies that something is very serious, should only be used when it is appropriate to do so. Using it to create an illusion that something is more serious than it was does more harm, in my opinion, because you're creating an illusion and you're diminishing the value of what you put on warnings. For example, I'll often see a trend in a particular company. A company might be very prone to putting gross on their warnings. Gross negligence, gross insubordination, gross dishonest conduct, and so forth. By putting gross on many of the warnings, employees stop taking them seriously. The word gross starts to lose its meaning because it's being overused, and it's not being reserved for being used when it is appropriate to do so. The other way that it diminishes the value of warnings is when an external person, somebody like me, an external chairperson, or the CCMA or the bargaining council, somebody else who is adjudicating a matter and looking at the warnings. If we can see that gross is a word that's commonly used, we're seeing it on a lot of warnings, and we're also seeing it on warnings where we know that incident or that type of incident is not typically deemed that severe, it does undermine the validity of the disciplinary action that gets taken, and it also undermines the perception that somebody may have of a company where we're seeing an overuse or a misuse of the word gross. So my recommendation for what to do instead, use the word gross when it's appropriate to do so. On my website, there is a disciplinary guide where I detail different types of offenses and I put them into different categories of offenses. And there I will put insubordination as one, and under it gross insubordination, and I will put my typical recommended sanction. If I put gross in front of something, you're typically going to see that my recommended sanction is going to be a final written warning or dismissal for a first offense, because it means it's serious. If you are issuing a lesser sanction than a final written warning or a dismissal, then the word gross was probably not appropriately used. If you're doubting yourself and you don't know whether this should be deemed as serious or not, or whether you should be using the term gross or not, my recommendation is err on the side of caution and leave it off. It does no harm to leave it off if you are properly depicting the offense. And here's another important tip. Focus less on being fancy and more on being accurate. That's to say, use less complex language and simply write out what happened. This is a theme you're going to see run through this video and loads of my other videos. A major tip of mine is to keep it simple. Next up, focus on the behavior, not the outcome. Disciplinary action is corrective measures. That means we are trying to correct behavior. We are trying to prevent a particular behavior from happening again. We are trying to take action such that the behavior of employees align with the purpose of the business and the goals of the business. And when they don't, we want to correct it using disciplinary action. Now for that, we hold people accountable for their behavior. Somebody can only change their behavior. They can only change what they're in control of and what they can do. Therefore, a warning should primarily focus on the behavior of the person. If you include literally nothing else on the offense and just write out what the person did, what their behavior was, as if you're describing it to somebody who wasn't there, that would be an appropriate way to word an offense on a warning. Now I'm going to give you an example of what not to do. Years ago, I chaired a hearing. On the notice to attend, under the charge sheet or the allegations, was the words broke toilet. That's it. Nothing else. Actually, I think it said gross misconduct, broke toilet. This is not an appropriate way to phrase a charge for a hearing, and this is not an appropriate way to phrase an offense on a warning. Because broke toilet tells me that the toilet was broken. It also tells me nothing about what the employee did, other than they might have been involved in the toilet breaking. It doesn't tell me whether it was malicious, was it willful, was it an accident, was it negligence, was it misuse? Did they stand on it and then it broke? Did they throw something on it? Did they drop something on it? And in this case, the company actually didn't know. They simply knew that the employee was in and around that area and then the toilet was broken. A broken toilet is an outcome. It is not a behavior. In order to hold somebody accountable, we need to know what their behavior was. And on a warning and on a charge sheet, you need to put what the behavior of the person was. We can add outcomes like broken toilet, but only as an additional add-on, as extra information. The primary focus needs to be on the behavior. Let's hypothetically say that the company did know what happened. A more appropriate way to phrase it, for example, would have been misuse of company property in that you stood on the toilet and it broke. Now let me give you another example, a more difficult one, but it's one that happens quite often. A warning issued for disrespect with no other information. A side note here, you can have vague wording on warnings in cases where you've covered verbally exactly what that warning relates to. The employee knows exactly what the warning relates to. The managers know what the warning relates to. And then you choose to write less details on the warning, but everybody involved is aware of what the warning relates to, what the behavior was, and what needs to happen with correcting the behavior going forward. Now, while this is okay, it isn't good practice, in my opinion, to have only 1 or 2 words on a warning. This tells people looking at the warning very little about what actually happened. More information is often better. An example of this is, as a chairperson, we look at previous warnings to determine whether somebody has committed the same or similar offense in the past. If there is very little information on the warning, a chairperson will often have to ask questions about the incident that led to that warning, which does take up time in the hearing, but also in my experience, as soon as the discussion comes about, the employee will want to say something, and it can run the risk of unnecessarily derailing the procedure that we're focused on. If the warning was issued with enough information, the chairperson wouldn't have to ask anything. They can simply read the warning and know whether it's the same or similar. Something that's also happened quite often in my experience is that companies will have various managers issue warnings, and then by the time a chairperson needs to understand if a warning was issued for the same or similar offense, the manager who issued that warning no longer works in the company. And in those cases, sometimes the company has nobody who can verify what the incident was about or what exactly transpired that led to the warning. So my recommendation is, in most cases when it comes to warnings, more information is generally better, as long as the more information is accurate and just simply depicts what happened or what transpired that led to the warning being issued. Now back to disrespect. Disrespect is very subjective. Let's compare it to another offense. Unauthorized absenteeism, in that you were absent from work on the 5th of March without permission from your manager and without authorized leave. This is very objective. Was the person at work? Yes or no? Did the person have permission from their manager not to be at work? Yes or no? Did the person have authorized leave? Yes or no? Disrespect is more gray. It often has to do with what is generally acceptable and not acceptable in a company or in a particular culture. What we deem to be respectful or disrespectful will differ from person to person. There might be some similarities in terms of what we deem disrespectful, but you'll often find that between different people, what they evaluate to be disrespectful behavior may differ. What one person evaluates to be disrespectful, somebody else might not experience that behavior as disrespectful. Swearing to some people may be disrespectful. But there are companies where swearing is the norm. It is part of the company culture. It's very much accepted and it happens very frequently. In a company where swearing is accepted and also the norm and part of the company culture, it would be inappropriate to suddenly issue a warning for disrespect for swearing unless measures were taken to inform all the employees that swearing will no longer be accepted. It will be treated as a disciplinary offense, and only thereafter, if somebody transgresses, that the warning be issued. Let me give you another example. An employer sent me a screenshot of a discussion between them and an employee. The message said, "See the disrespect." I read the messages and I failed to see what would be considered disrespectful. I could see why the employer took offense to what was said, but I failed to see what would amount to disrespect in terms of taking disciplinary action, in my opinion. Now, given these examples, when it comes to something like disrespect, it is very important to put more information to detail what the person did that is considered disrespectful, since the word disrespect tells us very little about what somebody did. So what we do want, for example, is disrespectful behavior towards, and then typically we'll enter in who the behavior was directed at, so a manager, a customer, a supplier, in that you pointed your finger in their face and raised your voice and said. And then typically we'll enter in verbatim what the person said. Now, if it's generally accepted in a company that swearing is not allowed, and everybody is aware of this, then you could have a more simple warning that says something like, disrespectful behavior in that you swore during a meeting on the 5th of March. In most cases, you'll probably also put the exact words that were used on the warning. Let's do another example. Poor customer service. This is a very typical offense that will be on warnings in businesses that serve customers. Examples being hospitality and retail. In my experience of working with businesses who typically issue warnings for poor customer service, if there's no other information on that warning, I will inquire what exactly happened. And in many cases, I will get a response like, a customer complained. Therefore, we issued a warning for poor customer service. A customer complaint is very similar to broke toilet. It doesn't tell us anything about the person's behavior. And also, simply because a customer complained doesn't mean that the employee's behavior warrants a warning. So we need to understand, what did the employee do that led to the customer complaint? And if they were issued a warning, we need to understand what the behavior was that the warning was issued for. So here we'll want more details. And poor customer service, rather than like in the toilet example where broke toilet would have been the outcome, poor customer service can be the categorization or the description that we start the warning with. So we'll say something like, poor customer service in that a table that you are responsible for waited 30 minutes before being served. This resulted in a customer complaint and a negative review. So in this example, poor customer service is the categorization or the term that we're using to describe the offense. Then we detail the offense, and then we put the outcome, which is a customer complaint and a negative review. Now this leads me to typically how we want to phrase the offense on a warning. We want to phrase it as the category or the description, if we know what it is, the behavior of the person, and then the outcome or the potential outcome, if there was one. So speaking of potential outcomes and not just actual outcomes, we want to include those on warnings. I'll give you an example. Gross negligence in that you forgot to lock the cash box, which could have resulted in theft and a financial loss to the business. The theft in this case did not occur and the company did not have a financial loss. But we want to include this because if the only difference between something happening and not happening is a little bit of luck, so to speak, we want to treat those two scenarios the same. Not locking the cash box and then money was stolen, and not locking the cash box and money was not stolen. We want to treat those two scenarios the same. Because again, with disciplinary action, we're focusing on the behavior. The person has control over the behavior. They don't necessarily have control over the outcomes. So now why I said, generally speaking, we want to go categorization or description, behavior, outcome, or potential outcome, is that some offenses don't fit nicely into a category or a broad descriptive term. Just a reminder, there is a link to my website in the description box below where I have various templates that for a small fee you can purchase. Some of them are dedicated to detailing offenses where you can see different offenses and their categorization or what general descriptive words they would fall under. Now, if an offense does not fit nicely into a categorization or a general descriptive term, don't try and make it fit. If you don't know an appropriate general term to put in front of the offense, just leave that part out and start immediately with the behavior of the person. So instead of saying, for example, negligence in that you did X, Y, and Z, you will simply start the warning with on, enter the date, you did, and then whatever the person did. When you write out the behavior of the person, remember to include relevant details. One relevant detail that is very good to include is the date on which the offense happened. And here I want to share another tip. When writing out offenses on warnings or on disciplinary notices, or for the most part when taking disciplinary action, stay clear of evaluation language and stick to observation language. Let me give you an example of this. An evaluation. Jack recklessly crossed the road. Observation language. Jack ran across the road without checking to see if it was safe to do so. Reckless here is an evaluation. What you could do is use that evaluation as a general descriptive term. So you can say reckless behavior in that you ran across the road without checking whether it was safe to do so. More appropriate though, we'd probably put breach of safety standard in that you ran across the road without checking if it was safe to do so. This is an example where more than one descriptive term would be appropriate. For example, you could have used reckless, or we could have used breach of safety standard. The purpose of that initial wording on the warning is to give us at quick glance a description of what the incident relates to. You will often have offenses that can technically fit into more than one categorization or more than one descriptive term. What you want to do is pick the one that's the most appropriate and then try to be consistent within your business. Here I would recommend, I have a template down below. It is a quick disciplinary guide for managers and employers. On that template, there are tables with offenses and what I typically recommend as a sanction. What I recommend that employers and managers do within a business, if you have many people issuing warnings, is take a document like that, take the tables, make sure that all the managers have them, and then make sure that across your leaders, you are using consistent language when a similar offense transpires. Businesses run into risk when they are inconsistent in the disciplinary action that they take. Now, here I'm referring to the legislative risk as well as a general risk to the employment relationship. It is a legislative requirement to act consistently. That means that disciplinary action can be rendered unfair if an employer did not act consistently when the facts were similar. Now, the wording on a warning not being consistent would be fair or unfair depending on the circumstances. It's not necessarily going to render it unfair because different managers are using different words. However, it does increase the chances that you might run that risk, and also it's good employment relations practice to try to stick to consistent wording. On that note, what not to do. Please don't call everything negligence. I've seen negligence be overused and inappropriately used. Negligence refers to behavior that's contrary to that of a reasonable person. This could cover many things, which is why it's so often used. But my recommendation would be first to try see, is there another term or is there other wording that is more appropriate than using negligence? And only really use negligence when it appropriately describes what happened and there isn't a better way to describe what happened. Here's an example of one I've seen before. Negligence in that you did not rotate the stock, which resulted in expired stock being at the back. I would rather say dereliction of duty in that you did not rotate the stock, which resulted in expired stock being at the back. This is because stock rotation is typically part of somebody's job. It is part of their responsibilities and their duties. So therefore, to my mind, dereliction of duty would be a more appropriate way to describe what happened. Negligence would be something like negligence in that you wrote 105 instead of 150, which resulted in a loss of 45 to the company. Another important tip that I want to add here, please don't stack offenses or stack charges if you're writing out a disciplinary hearing notice. What that means is when you write out multiple offenses for the same incident where those multiple offenses that you're writing out refer to the exact same thing that happened. You can have different offenses on a warning, you can have multiple warnings, you can have multiple charges on a disciplinary notice. However, those different things need to genuinely refer to different parts of the incident and they need to not overlap or refer to the same things. There's quite a lot to charge stacking, so I'll cover that in a future video. For today's video, I'm going to end it off with a couple of just quick practical tips that I would recommend around issuing of warnings and the wording on warnings. I know that leaders are very busy, and because they're very busy, they typically lean towards what is the quickest thing to get done on that day, and the use of templates is very appealing. Please acquaint yourself with the template that you use and trust the source of the template. And please try to not use warning templates where all the different types of warnings are on one document. What I mean is it's one document that is a verbal warning, a written warning, a second written warning, a final written warning, and the person issuing the warning must tick or cross off which one is applicable in this scenario. In my many years of seeing warnings, of working with companies where I see the disciplinary action that they take, of chairing very, very many hearings and seeing warnings be issued, this is the number one thing that I see lead to errors in disciplinary action being taken. is the use of one document that has all the different types of warning on that one document. It's very easy to make a mistake using those documents. It is also often confusing to a person receiving that type of document. What I recommend, and you can for a small fee purchase my warning template bundle down below, but what I do recommend is have separate warnings: verbal written warning, second written warning, and final written warning. If you do choose to use one document where you're putting all of them, please just make sure that you use it properly and that you very clearly indicate what type of warning is being issued, and that you also appropriately alter the other information on that warning, because different types of warnings have different validity periods. Now, here's a practical tip that I see works quite well in businesses who issue a lot of warnings, and the time with which they need to issue them is quite quick. This is, for example, like restaurants, retail stores who have anywhere between 50 to like 200 employees, and you have similar types of transgressions that regularly occur. So a big one would be unauthorized absenteeism, poor timekeeping in that you were late, poor timekeeping in that you took an extended break or an unauthorized break, or even under the influence of alcohol. If you're often issuing warnings for the same thing, then I recommend you make a template specifically for that offense. So you just take the normal, say, written warning template or the final written warning template, and under where you write the offense, you will type in unauthorized absenteeism, in that you were absent without permission and without authorized leave on, and then you just put a line or you leave that part blank and remember to enter in the date. And so the thing that you're altering or changing when you issue that warning is the date. And of course, the name of the employee and the other details on the warning. If it's for something like late coming, you will want poor timekeeping, in that you were late on, and then the date, by, and then the time the person was late. Or you might have something like poor timekeeping, in that you arrived at, and then leave it blank, when your shift started at, and then leave that part blank, and then you just fill in that information. Some businesses who only look at their clock-in systems, for example, at the end of the week or every second week, might have something like continuous poor timekeeping, in that you were late on several days, and then in brackets, see attached the clock-in sheet, and then have the clock-in sheet attached to it with it circled or highlighted when the person was late and by how much time they were late. This not only saves your leaders time, it also improves the consistency for offenses that regularly occur and for offenses that are not typically complex and don't require a lot of flexibility in terms of the wording. This approach is not appropriate for other offenses that need a more flexible, more case-by-case type of approach. However, there are often scenarios where it is very helpful to have templates for specific offenses. And with that, I'm going to end off today's video. If you found that it was useful, please remember to like this video. If you like my content, please remember to subscribe to my channel. If there's a template that you're needing or a guide that you're needing and you're not sure what on my website would be appropriate for your needs, or you're looking for something and you're not finding it on my website, just pop me an email. My email address is in the description box below, and I'll see if I can help you. Thank you so much for watching today's video.